The daughter, with a glacial smile that didn't reach her eyes, watched her mother in the chair. There was no love, only a cold calculation in the mind of the one who should have been a guardian. With a swift, dissembling gesture, she released the chair's brake, giving it a slight push towards the steep incline. The plan was perfect in its silent cruelty. The chair would gain speed. The mother would plummet into the waterfall below, and the wind, always the wind, would be blamed for another tragedy of nature. The elderly woman, oblivious to the betrayal, felt the jolt and the start of the descent, a mute terror beginning to settle in her fragile chest. The chair rolled, the waterfall roared ever closer, an abyss of icy waters waiting. But on nearby rocks, a male lion, which until then had seemed only a dormant shadow, opened its golden eyes. With astonishing agility it leapt, and in the last second before the chair reached the point of no return, its powerful jaws closed precisely over the wheel, paralyzing the cruel fate. The roar that followed was not one of hunt, but of warning, a primordial sound that chilled the cruel daughter to the bone. The lion, with the mother now safe, turned slowly to the villain. Its fixed gaze, its imposing presence pushed her back, step by step, until she found herself cornered on the ravine, terrified not by violence, but by the wild justice that observed her, a mirror of her own coldness reflected in nature's fury. The heavy afternoon air seemed to vibrate with the roar that still echoed, a sound that promised not death, but a brutal truth. The daughter, so calculating before, was now just a heap of fear. Her eyes, once glacial, were wide, fixed on the lion's golden orbs. There was no longer the glint of malice, only the reflection of a primal dread. The ravine, once a silent accomplice to her nefarious plan, was now a cold, rough wall against her back, trapping her. She tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. Every muscle in her body screamed to flee, but her legs seemed rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the majestic and menacing presence before her. The lion, a king in its wild domain, did not move. It merely watched her, a gaze that seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping bare every cruel intention, every dark thought she had harbored. It was not the blind fury of a predator, but the terrifying calm of a judge. The wind, which she had hoped to blame, now whispered around, seeming to mock her failure, carrying the damp scent of the waterfall that, by a narrow margin, had not become her mother's tomb. The elderly woman, still in the wheelchair, was in shock. Her mind, clouded by age and fright, was slow to process the sequence of events. The jolt, the dizzying descent, the deafening roar, and now the unbelievable sight of a lion. Not a lion in a cage, but there, real, alive, with her chair's wheel still caught between its powerful teeth. Slowly, the fog of fear began to dissipate, giving way to a painful clarity. She looked at her daughter, cornered, her face pale and distorted by terror, and then, at the chair's brake, which she now saw, was released. The truth, cold and cruel, struck her like lightning. It hadn't been the wind. It hadn't been an accident. It had been her own flesh, her own blood, that had pushed her into the abyss. A solitary tear traced a path down her wrinkled face, not from fear of the lion, but from the searing pain of betrayal. The lion, as if sensing the revelation of truth, released the chair's wheel with a gentle yet calculated movement. The chair remained still, safe. Its eyes, however, never left the daughter. It took a slow, heavy step, its enormous padded paw thudding on the ground with a force that made the earth tremble beneath the villain's feet. She gasped, a hoarse, desperate sound. The lion did not roar again, but a deep growl emerged from its chest, a warning more potent than any scream. The daughter, in her desperation, began to babble. "No, please, I didn't do anything." Her words were a tangle of lies and pleas, but the lion seemed indifferent to human rhetoric. It stood there, the personification of untamed nature, of order restored. Its golden eyes were mirrors of truth, and in them the daughter saw herself, the monstrosity of her intention. The lion tilted its head slightly, a movement that to an outside observer might seem curious, but to the daughter it was a sentence. It would not attack her with claws or teeth, not immediately. The punishment it imposed was far more subtle, far more terrifying. The confrontation with her own wickedness, the humiliation of being judged by a wild creature that, in its simplicity, understood justice better than she did. It took another step, further closing the distance. The lion's musky scent, its warm, heavy breath, now hung over her. She could feel the heat of its body, the immense strength contained in every muscle fiber. The ravine behind her seemed to deepen. The waterfall roared louder, as if the whole world was witnessing that reckoning. The daughter closed her eyes for an instant, wishing it were all a nightmare. But upon opening them, the imposing image of the lion was still there, unyielding. The mother, now with a clearer mind, watched the scene with a mixture of horror and a strange sense of relief. The lion was not a threat to her. It was her unexpected guardian, but what would it do to her daughter? The question hung in the air, as heavy as the tension between the beast and the villain. The lion, with a slow, deliberate movement of its head, indicated with its muzzle the direction of the waterfall, not to the mother but to the daughter. It was a silent invitation, a terrible choice. The abyss or the wild fury. The lion needed no words to communicate its verdict. The daughter, her heart pounding erratically, felt the ground give way slightly beneath her feet, the edge of the ravine dangerously close. The lion was not pushing her, but its presence was an irresistible force, compelling her to face the consequences of her actions. The cruel daughter's eyes danced in a frantic ballet between the roaring abyss of the waterfall and the imposing figure of the lion. The beast's silent invitation was a sentence, a terrible choice that echoed not in her ears, but in her soul. On one side, the dizzying fall, the icy water, and the darkness she herself had planned for her mother. On the other contained fury, wild justice personified in a king of nature who did not blink, did not move, only watched. The ravine, once a refuge for her malice, was now a cold, unforgiving stone wall against her back, trapping her. She felt the earth give way slightly beneath her feet, a cruel reminder of the precipice's proximity. The lion was not physically pushing her, but its presence was an invisible, irresistible force that compelled her to face the consequences of her actions. The air around her seemed thin, each breath an effort. An inarticulate moan escaped her throat, a sound of pure terror. She tried to babble, "No, please," but the words were lost in the constant roar of the waterfall, which seemed to mock her plea. The lion, with its head still slightly tilted, showed no sign of understanding or pity. Its golden eyes, once merely a reflection of her own coldness, were now a mirror, showing her the monstrosity of her intention. The mother, still in the wheelchair, watched everything with a painful clarity. The initial shock had given way to bitter comprehension. The solitary tear on her wrinkled face was no longer from fear, but from a profound sadness, a searing pain that only a child's betrayal can cause. She saw the terror in her daughter's eyes, the humiliation of being judged by a creature that, in its wild simplicity, seemed to understand morality more deeply than humanity itself. The elderly woman tried to move, perhaps to intervene, perhaps to flee from that scene of horror, but her fragile body and the immobilized chair held her captive. The lion took another slow step, its padded paws barely making a sound, but the impact resonated in the villain's chest. The musky scent of the beast, its warm, heavy breath, now hung over her, a cloud of primal threat. She could feel the heat emanating from the animal's muscular body, the strength contained in every fiber, ready to be unleashed. The ravine seemed to deepen, The waterfall roared louder, as if the whole world was witnessing that reckoning. The daughter closed her eyes tightly, wishing it were all a nightmare, an illusion. But upon opening them, the imposing image of the lion was still there, unyielding, a guardian of wild justice. She tried to retreat again, but the ravine was a solid wall, and the lion's presence before her was an insurmountable barrier. There was nowhere to go except down towards the abyss she had prepared for her own mother. The lion, with a low, deep growl that vibrated in the air, moved its head again, and this time its muzzle lightly touched the villain's shoulder, a touch that was not of affection but of warning, a subtle and irrefutable push. There was no explicit violence, only the undeniable pressure of its presence, forcing her to contemplate the precipice. The daughter's heart pounded erratically, a drum of dread in her ears. She felt the cold of the stone behind her, the damp wind of the waterfall on her face, and the menacing heat of the lion before her. In her mind, images of her plan replayed. The released break, the dissembling push, the glacial smile. Now she was the prey, cornered, confronted with the same darkness she had wished upon her progenitor. The lion would not attack her with claws or teeth, not yet. The punishment it imposed was far more subtle, far more terrifying. The confrontation with her own wickedness, the humiliation of being judged by a wild creature that, in its simplicity, understood justice better than she did. The lion retreated a single step, breaking physical contact, but maintaining psychological pressure. Its golden eyes did not leave her, and the daughter, in her desperation, realized that it was not death the lion offered her, but the choice between redemption through the recognition of her error or the final fall, be it into the abyss or into the fury of the beast. The silence, broken only by the roar of the waterfall, was deafening. Time seemed to have stopped, suspended between life and death, between betrayal and justice. The daughter was alone, before her judge, and the verdict was in her own hands, or rather at her own feet, dangerously close to the edge. Time, suspended between the abyss and the beast, stretched into an eternity of dread. The daughter, her feet dangerously close to the edge of the ravine, felt her heart pound against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the incessant roar of the waterfall. The lion, majestic and imposing, did not move, but every fiber of its being seemed to vibrate with a silent authority, a primal force that held her more effectively than any chain. Its golden eyes, once merely a reflection of her own cruelty, were now mirrors, reflecting back the distorted image of her soul. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt dense, laden with the musky scent of the lion and the icy dampness of the abyss. A scream of despair formed in her throat, but remained trapped, transforming into an inarticulate moan. "No, please," she babbled again, the words lost in the chaotic sound of the environment. Her voice, once firm and manipulative, was now a thin thread, almost inaudible. The mother, still in the wheelchair, watched the scene with painful clarity. The pain of betrayal was a heavy burden, but the sight of her daughter cornered, confronted with the monstrosity of her actions, brought a strange and disturbing sense of reckoning. It was not vengeance she desired, but rather that her daughter understand the gravity of her error. The solitary tear on her wrinkled face now mingled with the cold sweat of fear, not for herself, but for the uncertain outcome of that family tragedy. She tried to speak, perhaps to plead with the lion, perhaps to call out to her daughter, but her voice failed her, trapped in her throat by shock and weakness. The daughter, in her desperation, sought her mother's gaze, a last appeal for pity, for an intervention that would save her from that wild creature. But in the elderly woman's eyes, she found only a profound sadness, a pain that was a mirror of her own guilt. There was no forgiveness there, not yet, only the harsh truth. The one she had tried to kill now witnessed her judgment. In a last, desperate effort to escape that prison of stone and flesh, the daughter tried to move sideways, seeking an escape point where the ravine was less steep, where the lion's presence was less oppressive. But the beast, as if anticipating her movement, blocked her path with a minimal but decisive shift. There was no aggression, only the reaffirmation of its position, an insurmountable wall of muscle and determination. She was completely cornered. The lion, with a low, deep growl that vibrated in the air and made the ground tremble beneath the villain's feet, moved its head again. This time, its muzzle did not touch her shoulder, but pointed directly at the brake of her mother's wheelchair, which she had released. It was an unequivocal gesture, a silent accusation that laid bare her cruel intention. The daughter felt a shiver run down her spine, a cold more intense than the waterfall's wind. The beast knew, it knew everything, the humiliation of being unmasked by a wild creature which did not speak, but saw with brutal clarity, was almost as unbearable as the fear of death. Her lies, her justifications, all crumbled before that golden, penetrating gaze. She could no longer deny it. She could no longer blame the wind. The lion retreated a single step again, breaking physical contact but maintaining psychological pressure. Its golden eyes did not leave her, and the daughter, in her desperation, realized that it was not death the lion offered her immediately, but the choice between redemption through the recognition of her error or the final fall, be it into the abyss or into the fury of the beast that watched her. The silence, broken only by the roar of the waterfall, was deafening. Time seemed to have stopped, suspended between life and death, between betrayal and justice. The daughter was alone before her judge, and the verdict was in her own hands, or rather at her own feet, dangerously close to the edge. The decision now was hers, and the lion waited. The decision now was hers, and the lion waited. The silence, broken only by the roar of the waterfall, seemed to amplify the echo of the daughter's own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. Her eyes, once fixed on the abyss, now moved desperately between the lion's impassive face and her mother's lacerated gaze. What did the lion expect? A confession, an act of contrition, or simply the inevitable, the moment when fear would make her yield to gravity and the void? The villain's mind was a whirlwind of denial and terror. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be that a wild creature without language, without human laws, could unravel the plot of her wickedness with such clarity. But the lion's muzzle, pointing to the released brake of the chair, was irrefutable proof. The beast knew, and somehow it judged. The humiliation was a poison spreading through her veins, mingling with the icy dread of imminent death. She tried to formulate an excuse, a lie, anything that could break the barrier of silence and condemnation surrounding her. I didn't. The words died in her throat, choked by their own falsity. The lion hadn't moved an inch, but the pressure of its presence was overwhelming. Its golden eyes, fixed on her, seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping bare every dark intention, every cruel thought. The mother, immobile in the chair, was a statue of pain. Her eyes, once filled with a resigned sadness, now carried a different intensity. It wasn't anger. It wasn't vengeance. It was a plea, a mute plea for her daughter to see herself, to recognize the monster she had become. The tear that streamed down her wrinkled face was no longer from fear, but from an agonizing compassion, a last hope that something could be saved from that moral precipice. The lion, as if responding to the mother's silent appeal, took a lateral step, a slow and deliberate movement. It wasn't an attack, but a reconfiguration of the chessboard. It didn't move away from the ravine, but opened a small corridor, a narrow path that led away from the edge, but which would force her to pass beside her mother's wheelchair. It was a clear choice, delineated by the beast, the abyss, or the confrontation with the victim of her cruelty. The daughter's heart leaped into her throat. The path was there, a chance to retreat from the physical precipice, but to take it, she would have to turn her back on the lion, and most terrifyingly, turn to her mother. Turn to the gaze that judged her without words, to the woman she had tried to murder. It was psychological torture, a corridor of humiliation and guilt. The musky scent of the lion intensified, and a low, guttural growl reverberated in its chest. Not of imminent threat, but of impatience, of a silent order for her to act. Time was running out. The wind howled, the waterfall roared, and the lion waited. With an uncontrollable tremor, the daughter began to move. Every muscle in her body screamed to flee, to throw herself in any direction but that one. But the lion's presence was an irresistible magnet, keeping her trapped in its orbit. Her feet, once paralyzed by fear, now dragged an inch at a time, away from the edge, towards the corridor the beast had opened. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, avoiding the lion's gaze, avoiding her mother's gaze. Shame was a heavy cloak, more suffocating than the thin air of the ravine. She could feel the warmth of the lion's body to her right, its warm breath on her neck, a constant reminder that she was being watched, judged with every hesitant step. Lie! She was beside the wheelchair, inches from her mother. The sound of the waterfall's roar seemed to diminish, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the erratic pounding of her heart. She dared not look up. The mother, for her part, said not a word. She merely watched her, with tear-filled but firm eyes. The lion, with an almost imperceptible movement, pushed the mother's wheelchair not towards the abyss, but so that it faced the daughter, blocking any attempt at lateral escape. It was a gesture of containment, of forcing the confrontation. The daughter was trapped between the beast and the victim, between wild justice and human pain. A sob escaped her throat, a raw sound, devoid of any artifice. The mask of cruelty and indifference she had worn for so long shattered, revealing the fragility and terror beneath. She was no longer the calculating villain. She was a frightened child, cornered by her own actions. The lion, with a look that seemed to say, "Now, face the consequences," took another step back, increasing the distance, but without lessening the intensity of its vigilance. It no longer needed to physically force her. The prison was now internal, forged by guilt and by her mother's gaze. The choice was no longer between life and death, but between truth and denial, between recognition and self-destruction. And the mother, with her silent presence and visible pain, was the mirror where the daughter would finally have to see herself. The air was thick with expectation. The lion waited, the mother waited, and the world, in the form of that relentless waterfall, waited too. The sob that tore through the mountain air was not of anger, nor of defiance, but of a primordial pain, a cry of terror and shame that the daughter had kept imprisoned for years. The mask of cruelty, so carefully constructed and maintained, shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the fragile and terrified woman who hid behind it. Her knees buckled, and she fell heavily onto the rocky ground, her hands covering her face, as if she could thus erase the image of herself that the lion and her mother forced her to see. The roar of the waterfall, once a distant sound, now seemed to envelop the ravine, a relentless chorus to her despair. The musky scent of the lion, so close, was a constant reminder of the physical threat. But the sharpest pain came from within, from the forced recognition of her own monstrosity. She was no longer the predator, she was the prey, cornered not only by the beast, but by the truth of her actions. With an uncontrollable tremor, the daughter finally dared to lift her head, her swollen red eyes seeking her mother's gaze. It was an act of surrender, of desperation, of an urgent need to find something, anything, that could alleviate the overwhelming weight of her guilt. The mother, immobile in the wheelchair, watched her with an intensity that pierced her. There was no hatred in her eyes, nor the desire for vengeance that the daughter expected. There was only a profound sadness, an ocean of pain that seemed to swallow them both. And deep within that gaze, a silent question, a mute appeal. Why? The daughter tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat, transforming into an inarticulate moan. She wanted to ask for forgiveness. She wanted to explain the bitterness that consumed her, the envy, the resentment that led her to such a point. But how to explain the inexplicable, how to justify the unjustifiable? The mother's silence was more eloquent than any accusation, and the lion's immobility more terrifying than any roar. The lion, as if understanding the complexity of that human moment, remained in its position, a silent guardian of that painful truth. Its golden eyes, once penetrating and accusatory, now seemed to carry a strange wisdom, an ancestral patience that awaited the unfolding of that family tragedy. It did not move, did not growl, only observed, allowing the weight of conscience to do its work. The daughter, feeling the beast's gaze on her back, turned slightly, a movement of panic, as if expecting an attack. But the lion merely stared at her, and in its eyes she no longer saw the imminent threat of death, but the demand for a reckoning, for a reparation that went beyond physical violence. It was forcing her to face not death, but the life she tried to steal, and the life she had destroyed within herself. Shame was a fire that burned her face, mixing with tears and cold sweat. She could no longer flee, no longer deny. The image of the released break, of the imminent danger, of her mother's innocence, all projected in her mind like a horror film, and the director was herself. With a Herculean effort, the daughter crawled a little closer to the wheelchair, her trembling hands reaching out towards her mother. Not to touch her, not yet, but as a gesture of supplication, of desperation. "Mother," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and broken, almost inaudible above the roar of the waterfall. I'm so sorry." It was the first time in years that those words, devoid of cynicism or manipulation, had left her lips. They were raw, true, born of terror and humiliation, but still true. The mother, hearing the whisper, closed her eyes for an instant, a solitary tear tracing a path down her wrinkled face. It was not a tear of joy, nor of immediate forgiveness, but of an ancient pain that finally found an echo, a crack in the wall of ice the daughter had built. The lion, perceiving the confession, took another step back, increasing the distance between them. Its role as executioner seemed to have diminished, giving way to a more distant observation, almost of disapproval, but without the direct threat of before. It had done its part, to force the confrontation, to unmask the truth. Now the scales of justice were in the hands of the two women, and the verdict in the daughter's capacity to redeem herself and the mother's to forgive. The wind, which had once mocked, now seemed to carry the weight of that "I'm so sorry" away towards the abyss, as if to purify it. The daughter, still kneeling, felt the cold of the stone beneath her knees, the heat of shame on her face, and the emptiness in her chest, a void that only truth could begin to fill. She had hit rock bottom, and the lion, with its wild and unexpected intervention, had forced her to look up. The way back, if it existed, would be long and painful, but for the first time in a long time she felt a pale glimmer of hope, mixed with terror and guilt. The mother opened her eyes again, and the gaze, though still sad, contained a new depth, a complexity the daughter could not decipher. The judgment was far from over. The air, already thin from the altitude and heavy with tension, seemed to freeze the moment the mother reopened her eyes. There was no fury in her gaze, nor the relief that the daughter, in her selfish terror, might have expected. What the daughter found was something far more devastating, an abyss of sadness, a pain so deep and ancient that it transcended the heinous act just committed. It was the pain of a lifetime of disappointments, concentrated in that instant, in the kneeling, trembling figure before her. The tear that had streamed before was merely a prelude to the ocean of suffering now revealed. The daughter, still prostrate, felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. The words, "I'm so sorry," so difficult to utter, seemed insignificant, empty, before the magnitude of the pain she had inflicted. The lion, majestic and immobile, observed the scene with a gravity that seemed to reflect nature's own wisdom. Its golden eyes, once a mirror of threat, were now silent witnesses to a human tragedy, a family drama unfolding beneath the imposing shadow of the waterfall. It no longer needed to roar. The truth was the loudest roar there. The mother, with a visible effort, raised one of her wrinkled hands, not to touch her daughter, but to rest it on the arm of the wheelchair, as if seeking support, an anchor for her own fragility. Her voice, when it finally broke the oppressive silence, was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible above the clamor of the water, but laden with a strength that reverberated in the daughter's soul. "Being sorry," the mother began, and each syllable was a thread of pain, "doesn't erase the released break. It doesn't undo the fear of the fall. It doesn't heal the wound of knowing my own flesh desired my end." Her eyes did not waver from her daughter's, holding her captive in that inevitable confrontation. "I don't hate you, my daughter. That would be easy. I feel a disillusionment that weighs more than the world." The mother's words, devoid of anger, were 1,000 times sharper than any scream. The daughter felt a knot in her throat, a choked cry struggling to escape. She wanted to scream. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to explain the bitterness that consumed her, the envy, the resentment that led her to such a point. But all her justification seemed petty, pathetic, before the mother's broken dignity. The lion, as if sensing the shift in dynamics, took another step back, increasing the distance, but without averting its gaze. It was the observer, the judge, the catalyst. Its presence was no longer one of imminent threat, but of an implacable justice that demanded truth, reparation, confrontation. It had delivered the villain to her conscience, and now awaited the verdict. "Why?" The mother's voice, though still weak, gained a pleading tone, a question that had tormented her for years. "Why so much hatred? What did I do to you to deserve this?" The daughter trembled. The question, so direct and painful, struck the core of her existence. She had no answer that could be articulated without sounding like a confession of her own smallness. How to admit it was envy, insecurity, the resentment of a lifetime of imaginary comparisons, of self-imposed deprivations. The words, trying to form in her mind, were a tangle of accusations against her mother, against the world, against herself. But there, before that wounded gaze and the imposing presence of the lion, they crumbled to dust. She shook her head, tears streaming freely, mingling with the dust and sweat on her face. I don't know, Mother. I was blind. I lost myself." Her voice was a thread, almost inaudible, but it was the rawest truth she had uttered in years. It was the admission of a profound failure, of an internal darkness she had nurtured, and that now devoured her. The mother closed her eyes again, and this time the tear that streamed was heavier, more laden with resignation. "Lost," she repeated, her voice almost a lament, "and almost took me with you." She reopened her eyes, and in them was a renewed strength, a determination the daughter had never seen before. You can't just apologize and expect everything to be erased. Some things, they leave marks, scars that time doesn't heal. The wind howled, the waterfall roared, and the lion, with a slow and deliberate movement, sat on its hind legs, like a king on its throne, observing the unfolding of that painful confession. It was no longer the executioner, but the guardian of truth, the constant reminder that nature, in its wild wisdom, demands a reckoning. The daughter, feeling the lion's heavy gaze and her mother's cutting words, realized that the judgment was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. It was not a judgment of life or death, but of soul and redemption. And the path to any kind of forgiveness, if it existed, would be paved with the pain of her own actions, with the acceptance of her guilt, and with the arduous task of rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. She was cornered, no longer by the lion but by the truth. And that prison was far more terrifying. The daughter, still prostrate, felt the biting cold of the stone beneath her knees, a glacial reminder of relentless reality. The heat of shame, however, burned her face, mingling with the tears and cold sweat that streamed, salting her lips. The emptiness in her chest, once a hollow cavity of resentment, was now an abyss of guilt, an echo of the waterfall that roared incessantly, mocking her insignificance. Her mother's words, each one, were precise blows, not of anger, but of a pain so profound that the daughter felt as if she were being dismembered piece by piece, until nothing remained but the naked, raw truth. I was blind. I lost myself. The confession, so difficult to utter, now seemed pathetic, a flimsy excuse before the magnitude of what she had done, as if blindness justified the released break, the imminent fall, the desire for annihilation. The mother, her eyes still closed, seemed to absorb every syllable, every fragment of that belated admission. The tear that streamed down her wrinkled face this time was heavier, laden not with anger, but with an exhaustive resignation, a sadness that seemed as old as the world. "Lost," the mother repeated, her voice almost a lament that mingled with the wind's howl. "And almost took me with you." She reopened her eyes, and in them was a renewed strength, a determination the daughter had never seen before. It was not the strength of fury, but of survival, of wounded dignity that refused to be completely broken. You can't just apologize and expect everything to be erased. Some things, they leave marks, scars that time doesn't heal. The daughter trembled. Those words were the sentence, not a death sentence, but one of a lifetime of consequences. She had expected a scream, an explosion of anger, perhaps even a forgiveness forced by the situation. But the mother's calm, the depth of her pain, was far more devastating. The lion, as if sensing the weight of that moment, moved again, a slow and deliberate movement, sitting on its hind legs. It was a king on its stone throne, observing the unfolding of that painful confession, no longer the executioner, but the guardian of truth, the constant reminder that nature, in its wild wisdom, demands a reckoning. The lion's gaze, golden and penetrating, fixed on the daughter. There was no direct threat, but a silent demand, a pressure for her to face the totality of her actions. She felt the weight of that gaze, the force of that presence, as if the universe itself were judging her, and the verdict, she knew, would be implacable. "I know," the daughter whispered, her voice choked by the crying that finally broke free, convulsing her body. "I know it doesn't erase, but what do I do, Mother? What can I do?" It was a cry of desperation, the plea of someone who found herself at the bottom of a dark well, not knowing how to climb back out. The mother, however, offered no immediate answer. Her eyes, once fixed on her daughter, shifted to the waterfall, to the abyss that almost swallowed her. There was contemplation in her gaze, a meditation on the fragility of life and the destructive force of hatred. "You took much from me, my daughter," she said, her voice now almost inaudible, carried away by the wind. "Years of peace, of trust. The joy of having you near without fear. You took away the innocence of believing in your love." The mother's words were like knives, each one opening a new wound in the daughter's soul. She had never thought of it that way. In her distorted mind, she was the victim, the neglected daughter, the one who deserved more. But now, faced with the truth, she saw the trail of destruction she had left, not only in her mother's life, but in her own. Hatred, resentment, envy, all of it had consumed her, transforming her into something she barely recognized. The lion, as if understanding the complexity of that moment, let out a low, almost imperceptible growl that reverberated through the stones. It was not a growl of threat, but of warning, that the time for superficial apologies had ended. The daughter felt the air vibrate, and the message was clear: nature does not forgive frivolity. "There is no erase button, my daughter," the mother continued, turning her face back to her daughter, her eyes tear-filled but firm. "There is no easy way back. What you did, that is part of us now, part of your story, part of mine." She paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering all her strength. Forgiveness, if it comes, will be a long and painful path. And it's not something I can give you now. It's something you will have to earn, not from me, but from yourself. The daughter felt a shiver run down her spine. The mother was not offering a path, but a sentence of arduous labor, of a penance that might never end. The idea of earning forgiveness from herself was even more terrifying than earning forgiveness from her mother. How to forgive herself for such a vile act? How to live with the consciousness of having wished death upon her own mother? The wind howled, the waterfall roared, and the lion, with its imposing presence, seemed to seal the daughter's fate. She was cornered, no longer by the beast, but by the truth of her actions, by her mother's cutting words, and by the abyss of her own conscience. The prison was far more terrifying than any cage, for it was a prison of the soul, without visible bars, but with invisible chains that bound her to her crime. The judgment was not over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the path to any kind of redemption, if it existed, would be paved with the pain of her own actions, with the acceptance of her guilt, and with the arduous task of rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. She was alone with her truth, and the weight was unbearable. The daughter, prostrate, felt the air leave her lungs, not from the altitude, but from the overwhelming weight of her own soul. Her mother's words, "Earn from yourself," echoed in her mind like a perpetual sentence. How? How would she forgive herself for having wished death upon the one who gave her life? The cold of the stone beneath her knees was a physical reminder of the coldness of her own heart, and the heat of shame burned her face, mixing with the tears and sweat that streamed, salting her lips. The emptiness in her chest, once a hollow cavity of resentment, was now an abyss of guilt, an echo of the waterfall that roared incessantly, mocking her insignificance. She tried to lift her gaze, but her muscles seemed to have turned to lead. The image of her mother, sitting in the wheelchair, with the majestic lion beside her, was a sight that would be etched into her memory forever. It was the tableau of her own condemnation, painted with the colors of betrayal and wild mercy. The mother, her eyes tear-filled but firm, watched her daughter collapse. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a profound sadness, the pain of a mother who saw the fruit of her womb consume itself in its own darkness. She knew the words she had spoken were harsh, but they were the only truth she could offer. Easy forgiveness would be a lie, a denial of the depth of the wound. The lion, as if sensing the climax of the confession, let out a low, almost imperceptible growl that reverberated through the stones. Its golden eyes, fixed on the daughter, showed no anger, but an ancestral wisdom, the understanding that nature has its own ways of restoring balance. It was the herald of a justice that went beyond human laws, a justice that demanded confrontation with the self. The daughter, feeling the air vibrate with the lion's growl, raised her head, her swollen red eyes fixed on her mother. I don't know how, Mother," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "I don't know how to live with this. I am a monster." The final confession, the acceptance of her own monstrosity, was the breaking point. Her body convulsed in uncontrollable sobs, and she hunched over even more, as if wanting to disappear into the cold rock. The mother, seeing her daughter dissolve in despair, felt a pang of pain, but did not yield. This moment was crucial. It was rock bottom from which the daughter perhaps could begin to climb. "You will have to find out, my daughter," the mother said, her voice choked with emotion, but still carrying an unwavering determination. "There are no shortcuts to redemption. The path is long, and you will have to walk it alone." With a visible effort, the mother extended her hand to the lion, which still held the wheel of the chair. Her fingers touched the animal's soft, rough mane, a gesture of silent gratitude. The lion, in response, released the wheel with a gentle movement, its eyes never leaving the daughter. It had done its part. The mother then, with trembling but firm hands, began to push the wheelchair backward, slowly moving away from the edge of the abyss. Every inch was a victory, a step away from death and towards a new, uncertain life. The daughter, her eyes wide, watched her mother move away, terrified at the thought of being abandoned there, alone with the lion and her guilt. "Mother!" she cried, a strangled sound that barely escaped her throat. "Don't leave me! Please, Mother!" It was a desperate plea, the cry of a lost child, not of the cruel woman who had attempted murder. The mother stopped, but did not turn completely. Her eyes met her daughter's for a brief instant. "I am not leaving you, my daughter," she said, her voice softer now but still firm. "I am giving you the chance to find yourself, the chance to face what you did, and to decide who you want to be." She continued to push the chair, moving to a safer spot, away from the edge of the precipice. The lion, with a fluid and majestic movement, stood up and, with a final penetrating gaze at the daughter, began to walk away, slowly moving towards the shadow of the trees, disappearing into the dense foliage of the forest. Its task was done. It had been the catalyst, the guardian, the judge. Now justice would be delivered by the hands of time and conscience. The daughter remained there, alone, her body trembling, her face covered in tears and dirt. The lion was gone. Her mother had moved away, and the roar of the waterfall seemed to mock her solitude. The vastness of nature around her, once a backdrop for her crime, was now a mirror of her own inner emptiness. She was cornered, no longer by the beast, but by the truth of her actions, by her mother's cutting words, and by the abyss of her own conscience. The prison was far more terrifying than any cage, for it was a prison of the soul, without visible bars, but with invisible chains that bound her to her crime. The judgment was not over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the path to any kind of redemption, if it existed, would be paved with the pain of her own actions, with the acceptance of her guilt, and with the arduous task of rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. She was alone with her truth, and the weight was unbearable, and for the first time in her life, she did not know where to go or how to take the next step. The silence which followed the departure of the mother and the lion was more deafening than the roar of the waterfall itself, a silence that cried out for an answer she did not yet possess. The silence that followed the departure of the mother and the lion was more deafening than the roar of the waterfall itself, a silence that cried out for an answer she did not yet possess. Each beat of her heart seemed to echo in the vastness of that gorge, a funeral drum for the life she knew. The thin air, once just a detail of the altitude, now seemed to suffocate her, dense with the dust of her own ruins. She was prostrate, her body trembling uncontrollably, not only from the cold rising from the icy waters, but from a terror that chilled her soul to the bone. Her mother's words, "Earn from yourself," were a burden heavier than the very rocks that surrounded her. How to forgive herself, how to look in the mirror and not see the monster she had confessed to be. The image of her mother, her eyes tear-filled but firm, slowly moving away, was etched into her mind like an indelible scar. There was no explicit anger in her mother's gaze, only an abyssal sadness, the pain of a betrayed love, now replaced by an impenetrable distance. And the lion, the majestic beast that had cornered her, that had forced her to confront her truth, had disappeared. Its absence was almost as oppressive as its presence, leaving her without the guardian, without the judge, only with the relentless court of her own conscience. The smell of damp earth and moss, the constant sound of falling water, the vastness of the sky stretching endlessly above her, everything seemed to conspire to highlight her insignificance, the smallness of her existence before nature's indifferent grandeur. She tried to move an arm, but her muscles seemed paralyzed, as if her body refused to obey such a corrupted mind. The tears, mixed with dirt and sweat, formed salty rivulets on her face, a bitter taste that added to the bile rising in her throat. A flash of memory, quick and painful, crossed her mind, the image of herself. Years ago, an innocent child, running through fields with her mother, laughing, trusting. Where was that child? Where had the purity, the joy been lost? Resentment, like a parasite, had fed on her, growing, distorting, until it consumed everything and left only an empty shell filled with hatred. Now that shell was broken, and the emptiness was unbearable. She felt like a ship adrift in a stormy ocean, without sails, without a rudder, without a compass. Her mother had given her the chance to find herself. But how does one find something that is completely lost? How does one rebuild something that was deliberately demolished? The task seemed Herculean, impossible. The path was long, her mother had said, and she would have to walk it alone. Solitude was a punishment crueler than any cell, for it was a solitude of the soul, an absence of any comfort, of any immediate hope. The wind howled, mocking her fragility, and the roar of the waterfall seemed like a chorus of condemnation. She was there, at the edge of the abyss, no longer physical, but existential. The ground beneath her knees, the rough stones, the cold that penetrated her clothes, everything was a tangible reminder of her fall. She had wished her mother's death, and now she felt the death of a part of herself, the death of the illusion that she could escape unpunished, the death of her own identity as a victim. The idea of getting up seemed like a mountain to climb. Every fiber of her being cried out to remain there, huddled, waiting for the earth to swallow her, for the wind to carry her away, for the waterfall to purify her in some way. But her mother's voice echoed again, not as an order, but as an undeniable truth. There are no shortcuts to redemption. Redemption would not come from an easy death, nor from granted forgiveness. It would have to be forged in pain, in acceptance, in the arduous reconstruction of every brick of her soul. With a hoarse groan, barely distinguishable from the sound of the wind, she tried to move her fingers. A fingertip touched the cold stone, and a tingling sensation of life ran through her hand. It was an infinitesimal sign, a tiny spark amidst the overwhelming darkness. But it was a beginning, a painful, uncertain beginning, but a beginning. She didn't know where to go nor how to take the next step, but inertia, paralysis were no longer an option. The prison of her soul, without visible bars but with invisible chains, demanded an effort, a struggle, a desperate attempt to free herself. The judgment was not over. It was just beginning, and the path to any kind of redemption, if it existed, would be paved with the pain of her own actions, with the acceptance of her guilt, and with the arduous task of rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. She was alone with her truth, and the weight was unbearable. But for the first time in her life, the idea of facing that weight, however terrifying it was, seemed the only way out. Her mind, once a whirlwind of denial and self-justification, was now a battlefield where the naked, raw truth refused to be ignored. She had tried to push her mother to her death, and the image of the wheelchair swaying dangerously at the edge of the precipice with her mother defenseless was a horror film replaying incessantly in her memory. The lion, with its primordial strength, had been the brake, the mirror reflecting the monstrosity of her intentions. And now she was there, her body heavy and her soul even heavier, feeling the weight of every wrong choice, every cruel word, every dark thought that had led her to that point. She tried, with superhuman effort, to lift her head. Her neck cracked, her muscles protested, but she managed to raise her gaze, not to the sky, but to the stones in front of her. They were rough, uneven, covered in moss and small cracks. There was no beauty there, only the harsh reality of the rock. And somehow that brutal reality was a comfort. There was no room for illusions, for escapes. Only the stone, the ground, and herself. With a dry mouth and the taste of blood and dirt, she tried to swallow. Her throat was raw, as if she had screamed for hours. Perhaps she had. The cries of despair, the appeals to her mother still echoed in her ears, proof that deep down a part of her still feared solitude and consequence. But the fear now was different. It wasn't the fear of being caught, of being punished by an external authority. It was the fear of herself, of what she was capable of, and of what she would have to become to stop being that. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, she began to push her body. Her knees, which were bent beneath her, ached with the weight. Her arms, weak and trembling, could barely support her torso. It was as if every cell in her body was in rebellion, exhausted, wounded. But the spark, that tiny sensation of life in her fingers, persisted. It was a promise, a reminder that despite everything, she was still alive. And if she was alive, there was a chance, a tiny, painful, almost impossible chance, but a chance. The wind, once a mocker, now seemed to whisper ancient secrets of the mountains, stories of resilience and time. The waterfall, with its incessant roar, was the soundtrack to her own purgation. She didn't know how long she had been there, prostrate. Hours? Minutes? The notion of time had dissolved, replaced by the eternity of her torment. But the need to move, not to remain in that state of total helplessness, began to overcome the pain and despair. With a moan that turned into a grunt of pure determination, she finally managed to turn onto her side. Her body rolled heavily, and she felt the sharp pain of every bone, every muscle. But now she was on her stomach, her hands and knees touching the earth. It wasn't much, but it was progress. It was the first step out of the abyss, the first movement away from the brink of death. Not just physical, but spiritual. The sight of the ground, so close, so real, was the only thing that mattered. The path would be long and tortuous, but she had begun to crawl, and in that moment, crawling was all she could do. The judgment was not over, it was just beginning, and the path to any kind of redemption, if it existed, would be paved with the pain of her own actions, with the acceptance of her guilt, and with the arduous task of rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. She was alone with her truth, and the weight was unbearable. But for the first time in her life, the idea of facing that weight, however terrifying it was, seemed the only way out. And, with her forehead pressed against the cold earth, she took a deep breath. A sigh that carried the weight of a world, but also the lightness of a new, still fragile determination. With her forehead pressed against the cold earth, she took a deep breath, a sigh that carried the weight of a world, but also the lightness of a new, still fragile determination. The smell of damp earth and the icy moss against her skin were the only tangible reality. Her muscles, once paralyzed by shock and guilt, now burned with a dull ache, as if every fiber was being stretched and torn from within. The idea of getting up seemed like an affront to gravity, a challenge to a body that cried out for surrender. But her mother's voice, echoing in her mind, was stronger than the exhaustion. There are no shortcuts to redemption. Redemption would not be a gift, but a conquest forged in suffering, in acceptance. And acceptance began there, with the pain of every tendon, every bone that protested against the slightest movement. She tried to push her body up, leaning on her forearms. Her muscles trembled, giving way under the weight, and she collapsed again, a hoarse groan escaping her cracked lips. The taste of earth and blood in her mouth was a bitter reminder of her fall, of her own violence. The wind howled, mocking her weakness, and the roar of the waterfall seemed to intensify, like a chorus of condemnation. But this time, something was different. Instead of cowering, she felt a pang of anger, not against the world, but against her own inertia, against the part of her that still wanted to flee, that wanted the earth to swallow her. No, she would not be swallowed. Not anymore. With a determination that seemed to come from an unknown place within her, she tried again. This time, she focused on every muscle, every joint, her arms trembling, stretched out, her knees aching, steadied. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, she managed to lift her torso, supporting herself on her hands and knees. Her head hung, tangled hair falling over her face, but she was on all fours, her body trembling like a leaf in the wind. It was a minuscule victory, almost imperceptible, but it was a step, the first step out of the abyss. The world spun. Vertigo hit her hard, and for a moment she thought she would faint. The waterfall, once a distant sound, now seemed to engulf all space, its deafening roar filling every crevice of her mind. But she clung to the earth, to the rough stones beneath her hands, to the sensation of life that still pulsed in her veins. She couldn't stop. Not now. The image of her mother, her eyes tear-filled but firm, moving away, was a beacon in the darkness. There was no anger, only sadness, and that sadness was a burden heavier than any condemnation. How could she have caused so much pain to someone who loved her unconditionally? The memory of the wheelchair swaying dangerously at the edge of the precipice, of her defenseless mother, was a horror film replaying incessantly in her mind. The lion, with its primordial strength, had been the brake, the mirror reflecting the monstrosity of her intentions. It had forced her to see, to feel, to confess. With a Herculean effort, she managed to lift her head. Her neck cracked. Her muscles protested, but she managed to raise her gaze to the stones in front of her. They were rough, uneven, covered in moss and small cracks. There was no beauty there, only the harsh reality of the rock. And somehow, that brutal reality was a comfort. There was no room for illusions, for escapes, only the stone, the ground, and herself. The thin air, once a suffocation, now seemed to fill her lungs with a new urgency. Every breath was an act of will, an affirmation that she would choose to continue. She tried to move one knee, then the other. The pain was excruciating, but she embraced it, allowing it to be a guide, a constant reminder of the price of her actions. Every movement was a battle, every inch gained, a hard-won victory. She dragged herself, inch by inch, away from the edge of the precipice. There was no clear destination in her mind, only the visceral need to move away from that point of no return, from that abyss that had almost consumed her. The sun, which had seemed indifferent before, now began to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The light diminished, and with it, the hope that someone would find her, rescue her. But she didn't want to be rescued. She needed to rescue herself. Solitude was a punishment crueler than any cell, for it was a solitude of the soul, an absence of any comfort, of any immediate hope. But paradoxically, it was also the necessary condition for her reconstruction. Without distractions, without escapes, just her and her naked, raw truth. With a final effort, she managed to sit up, her back against a cold, damp stone, her legs stretched out in front, her arms resting on her knees. Her body trembled uncontrollably, exhausted, but her mind was strangely clear. The roar of the waterfall, the howl of the wind, the smell of the earth, everything merged into a wild symphony, the soundtrack of her own purgation. She looked at her own hands, dirty with earth and scratched, hands that had tried to push her mother to her death, hands that now struggled to rise, to rebuild themselves. The task seemed Herculean, impossible. The path was long, her mother had said, and she would have to walk it alone. But in that moment, sitting among the stones, her body aching and her soul in tatters, she knew there was no other choice. The spark, that tiny sensation of life in her fingers, now burned with a slightly greater intensity. It was a small fire, but it was lit, and she would protect it, no matter the cost. The judgment was not over. It was just beginning, and the path to any kind of redemption, if it existed, would be paved with the pain of her own actions, with the acceptance of her guilt, and with the arduous task of rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. She was alone with her truth, and the weight was unbearable. But for the first time in her life, the idea of facing that weight, however terrifying it was, seemed the only way out. And in that twilight that engulfed the mountain, she would no longer flee, she would face it. Twilight engulfed the mountain, transforming the vibrant colors of day into somber shades of purple and gray. The air, once merely fresh, now carried the biting cold that precedes night at high altitudes. Each breath became visible, a small cloud of vapor that rapidly dissipated, taking with it the illusion of warmth. She sat, her back against the cold stone, her body trembling not only from exhaustion, but from a chill that began to penetrate her bones. The pain, a constant companion, now mingled with the icy sensation creeping up her legs and arms. But, more than the cold, there was a feeling, a presence. It wasn't the wind, nor the roar of the waterfall growing deeper with the darkness. It was something more primitive, more dense. Her eyes, once fixed on her own dirty hands, slowly lifted, sweeping the ravine. Shadows danced, lengthening, distorting the familiar shapes of rocks and bushes. And then she saw it. There was no roar, no abrupt movement, only the imposing silhouette, almost merged with the growing darkness a few meters away. The lion, its eyes, two golden embers in the gloom, were fixed on her. There was no explicit anger, nor the intention to attack that one would expect from a wild beast. There was only an implacable vigilance, an ancestral patience that cornered her more effectively than any cage. It was the guardian of that abyss, the silent judge who had forced her to confront her own monstrosity. A shiver ran down her spine, but it wasn't just fear, it was a recognition. The lion had not abandoned her. It remained there, a sentinel of truth, ensuring she would not flee, would not evade the weight of her actions. That gaze, once terrifying, now seemed like a mirror, reflecting the image of who she had become and, more importantly, of who she needed to stop being. Her throat was dry, her voice trapped, but there was no need for words. The communication between them was of an older, deeper order. It had stopped her. It had saved her from herself. And now it watched her as she began to save herself. The cold intensified, and the reality of the approaching night hit her hard. She couldn't stay there, exposed. Hypothermia would be an end as cruel as falling into the waterfall, and of an even more bitter irony. The lion would not attack her, but nature would, and nature did not forgive weakness. With a muffled groan, she tried to move again. Her muscles protested, every fiber screaming in agony. But the lion's presence, a few meters away, was a catalyst. She couldn't surrender there under that gaze, not after everything, not after having finally begun to see. She dragged herself, using her elbows and knees closer to the rock that offered protection. There was a small crevice, a recess in the stone that might offer some shelter from the biting wind. Every inch was an eternity of pain, But the image of her mother, her face marked by sadness, not anger, was an implacable engine. Her mother, how could she have forgotten the unconditional love that had always surrounded her? How had the darkness of her own soul obscured the purest light of her life? Guilt was an overwhelming burden, but now, paradoxically, it was also her strength. It was the promise that, if she survived that night, if she managed to rise again, it would be to try somehow to repair the irreparable. She managed to squeeze into the crevice, her body huddled, trembling. The cold stone against her back and sides offered minimal protection, but it was something. She pulled her knees to her chest, hugging herself, trying to retain what little warmth remained. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. The lion did not move. Its eyes continued fixed on her, a constant presence, a reminder that the judgment was not over. The night would be long, and the darkness would bring not only the cold, but also the ghosts of her actions, the voices of her conscience that now could no longer be silenced. She closed her eyes, but the images persisted. The swaying wheelchair, her mother's face, the lion's roar, the abyss, the smell of earth and moss, the incessant sound of the waterfall, the howl of the wind. Everything merged into a wild symphony that enveloped her, a song of purgation and rebirth. The spark, that tiny flame of life she had felt in her fingers, struggled to survive. It was a battle against the cold that threatened to extinguish it, against the pain that tried to crush it, against the hopelessness that whispered in her ears. But the image of her mother, the unconditional love she had rejected, was the fuel that kept that spark alive. It was the promise that, if she survived, if she managed to rise again, it would be to try, somehow, to repair the irreparable. She clung to that promise with desperate ferocity. Every breath was an act of will, every heartbeat, an affirmation of her existence. She couldn't die there, not before having the chance to face her mother, to ask for forgiveness, to try to rebuild what she had destroyed. The solitude of that night was an implacable mirror, reflecting the vastness of her error, but also, paradoxically, the strength of her determination. The lion did not move. It was her shadow, her judge, her guardian. Its presence was a constant reminder that there was no escape. Redemption, if it existed, would have to be earned there on that icy ravine, under the gaze of the beast and the indifferent stars. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sky began to lighten. The darkness receded, replaced by a pale grey that announced the arrival of dawn. The shapes of the rocks and bushes began to define themselves, and the roar of the waterfall, though still potent, seemed less menacing. The wind lessened its lament, and an almost sacred silence hung in the air. The cold, however, did not yield. On the contrary, dawn brought with it the coldest point of the night. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale and purplish. She felt every bone, every muscle, but with the emerging light came also a clarity. The fog of exhaustion and despair began to dissipate, revealing a naked, raw truth. She was alive. With a monumental effort, she opened her eyes, which burned with dust and fatigue. The lion was still there, a few meters away, its majestic silhouette now more defined against the lightening sky. Its golden eyes, once embers in the darkness, now seemed to reflect the incipient light of the sun. There was something different in its gaze, an acceptance. Perhaps it was just her own perception that had changed. It was no longer just the monster that had cornered her. It was the catalyst of her truth, the mirror of her soul. It had forced her to see, to feel, to face. And somehow it had protected her, not just from the fall, but from herself. With a hoarse groan, she tried to move again. The pain was excruciating. But now there was a purpose. She needed to get out of there, not to flee, but to begin the long and arduous journey back. To her mother, to herself. The lion, as if sensing her intention, made a subtle movement. Not a roar, not an advance, but a slight tilt of its head, a slow blink of its eyes. And then, with a silent dignity, it turned and walked slowly away, disappearing among the rocks and sparse vegetation. It had done its part. The judgment was over. The sentence, the reconstruction, was now hers. She stayed there, watching the spot where it had disappeared, her body still trembling, but her mind strangely calm. The sun began to peek over the mountains, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The morning light, once just a distant promise, now bathed the ravine, revealing every detail of the rough stones, the damp moss, the small wildflowers blooming in the crevices. The spark in her chest, that tiny flame, now burned with a slightly greater intensity. She didn't know what the future held for her, nor how she would get up, nor how she would find her way back to civilization, much less to her mother's heart. But in that icy dawn, sitting among the stones, her body aching and her soul in tatters, she knew one thing. She would face it. She would begin. And for the first time in a long time, that certainty was not a burden, but a promise. The lion was gone, and with it, the imposing shadow of its judgment. A strange emptiness filled the space that had once been dominated by its presence, a mixture of relief and a new, even more frightening solitude. The morning light, now bathing the ravine, brought no immediate warmth, but revealed the rawness of her situation. She was alone, wounded, and the task of rising again seemed as monumental as the mountain that surrounded her. With a groan that was lost in the roar of the waterfall, she tried to move. Every fiber of her body screamed in protest. Her muscles, stiffened by the cold and the tension of the night, felt like stone. Her hands, scratched and swollen, could barely close. Pain was a thick veil covering every sensation, but beneath it, a stubborn determination began to form. She couldn't stay there. Not after having been spared, not after having been forced to see. Using her elbows and knees, she began to drag herself out of the crevice. The rough rock tore at her already sensitive skin, and the cold of the ground penetrated her bones. Every inch was a victory, an act of pure will. The image of her mother, so clear in her mind, was the anchor pulling her forward. It was no longer the mother she had tried to destroy, but the mother who had loved her unconditionally, the mother who deserved her repentance, her plea for forgiveness. Guilt, once a paralyzing weight, now transformed into a motor. It was the realization that if she didn't try, if she didn't fight to return, the darkness that had consumed her would have won completely, and she wouldn't allow it. Not anymore. The sun continued its slow ascent, and its rays, still weak, began to touch the treetops at the top of the ravine. That was her immediate destination. The top. The path was steep, covered with loose stones and sparse vegetation that offered little grip. She clung to an exposed root, pulling herself up with an effort that made her muscles tremble. A stone broke loose beneath her hand, rolling down the ravine with a dry sound that echoed in her mind, as a reminder of the fragility of her existence. Mother. The name escaped her cracked lips, an almost inaudible whisper. It was not a cry for help, but a prayer, a promise. She needed to reach her. She needed to look into her eyes and, for the first time in years, see herself through love, not hatred. With each small advance, the pain increased, but the spark in her chest, that tiny flame, now burned with a slightly greater intensity. It was fragile, yes, but it did not waver. It was the flame of hope, of redemption, of the possibility of a new beginning. She didn't know what the future held for her, nor how she would get up, nor how she would find her way back to civilization, much less to her mother's heart. But in that icy dawn, sitting among the stones, her body aching and her soul in tatters, she knew one thing. She would face it. She would begin. The ravine was a purgatory, a test of her newfound will. She dragged herself, climbed, slipped, and got up again. Every scratch, every bruise was a reminder of the price of her actions, but also of the price of her survival. The roar of the waterfall, once a sound of condemnation, now seemed like a hymn to resilience, to the strength of nature that had punished her and somehow had saved her. Hours passed, or perhaps they were just minutes stretching into an eternity of effort. The sun was now higher, and its warmth began to heat her skin, dispelling some of the biting cold. She finally reached a small platform, a point where the incline lessened and the vegetation was denser. There, exhausted, she collapsed, her body trembling but her heart beating with a new and strange vitality. She turned, looking down, into the abyss from which she had come. The waterfall roared below, majestic and indifferent. The spot where her mother's wheelchair had stopped, where the lion had intervened, was just a distant point. The wind, which she intended to blame, now blew softly, almost a whisper of regret. The vision was clear, and with it, the magnitude of her crime. But also the magnitude of her second chance. The lion had not killed her, nature had not swallowed her. She was alive, and that life was a gift, an opportunity. With a deep and painful breath, she forced herself to stand again. Her knees wavered, but she steadied herself. The pain was still there, but now it was a companion, not an enemy. She looked ahead, to the trail that stretched up the mountain, a promise of return, of a path, however long and difficult it might be. The spark now was a small but constant flame, warming the center of her being. She didn't know what she would find at the end of that path. Perhaps her mother's anger, perhaps society's scorn, perhaps prison. But she would face it. Because for the first time in a long time, that certainty was not a burden, but a promise. The promise that the darkness had receded and that the light, however faint, was there to guide her. The journey of redemption had just begun, and she would walk it, step by step, until the end.